Okay, so this what I'm presenting is a condensed version of the published version of the paper, and that paper responds to recent work on moral blame, which has drawn attention to the ambivalent nature of blame and of our social practices of blaming. Victoria McGeer, for example, points to a tension inherent in our blaming practices that seems to call into question their normative acceptability. On the one hand, she argues, blame plays a crucial functional role in our practices of holding each other and ourselves to account for disrespectful behaviour or wrongful actions. In playing this role, blame helps to scaffold and capacitate responsible agency. On the other hand, blame is often associated with negative reactive emotions and punitive responses that run counter to the aims of morality. McGeer argues that negative emotions such as anger are an inescapable feature of the psychology of blame, deeply embedded in our evolutionary heritage, and they cannot be sanitised away. Nevertheless, she argues if they're to be normatively acceptable and to serve their capacitating function, our blaming practices need to be civilised. Civilising blame requires the development of practices and institutions that enable meaningful dialogical trajectories of co-reactive exchange between wrongdoers and those they have wronged or the moral community. Another example of recent work that draws attention to the problematic aspects of blame is Hannah Pickard's discussion of normatively appropriate approaches to the clinical care of service users with personality disorders. Like McGeer, Pickard is attentive to the capacitating role of responsibility practices. And she argues on the one hand that good therapeutic care requires clinicians to treat service users with personality disorders as accountable and answerable for their behaviour. That is, it requires clinicians to engage in practices of holding responsible. On the other hand, negative reactive attitudes of affective blame, she argues, are therapeutically detrimental. And what characterises affective blame is its distinctive hurtful sting and also a second-order feeling of entitlement on the part of the blamer, that the blamed person deserves to be at the receiving end of the blamer's first-order negative emotional response. Now, I think McGeer and Pickard are right to draw attention to the normatively ambivalent nature of moral blame and of our blaming responses and practices. And I'm also sympathetic to the goal of civilising blame. What underlies this goal is the recognition that our social practices of blame and accountability, even if they're rooted in human psychology, are amenable to criticism and reform. However, my argument in the paper is that the project of civilising blame needs to take seriously the extent to which our reactive attitudes and moral responsibility practices can be entangled with the social dynamics of power and oppression. So I find McGeer's analysis of the civilising and capacitating function of reactive exchange illuminating, but I think it's based on very idealising assumptions. And specifically, it fails to engage with the problem that the supposedly capacitating features of our blaming practices can be implicated in structural injustice of various kinds and distorted by epistemic and discursive injustices. So the first aim of the paper is to show why neo-Strawsonian approaches to responsibility and blame, such as McGeer's, can't ignore this problem. And the second aim is to show that engaging with this problem raises questions about the tendency of neo-Strawsonian views to equate moral responsibility with liability to praise and blame. So in developing this argument in the published paper, I discuss in some detail a fictional case, the case of Kaya Clark, who's the central character in Delia Owen's novel Where the Crawdads Sing. I'll just make some very brief remarks about the character and the plot. I'm not going to go into the detail that I did in the published paper. So Kaya's a young woman who's lived a deprived and solitary life in the North Carolina marshes. Since childhood, she's experienced social ostracism as so-called marsh trash. She's suffered a series of abandonments and she's been subjected to violence and abuse. The events of the novel centre on her trial for the murder of Chase Andrews, a local football star and known womaniser, who's found dead in a remote location at the base of an abandoned fire tower in the marshes. Some years earlier, Kaya has had a sexual relationship with Chase, And during the period between the end of their relationship and her trial for his murder, she'd been subjected to a violent assault and attempted rape by Chase during a chance encounter at a remote beach. On that occasion, she managed to escape from him, but she's gripped with fear that she will never be safe from Chase, either in her home or in her boating expeditions in the marshlands. And the drama of the trial focuses on whether Chase's death was accidental or whether it was a carefully planned and executed murder by an exceptionally clever killer who knew exactly what she was doing. Now, whatever the plausibility of the plot and of Kaya as a character, the novel raises interesting questions about blame and about the blameworthiness of agents who commit wrongful acts, but in social circumstances characterised by poverty, structural injustice, neglect, and gender-based violence and abuse. What's the appropriate moral response to Kaya's actions and to Kaya as a moral agent? She's clearly causally responsible for Chase's death. I'm sorry, I've spoiled the ending for those who don't know the book. She's clearly causally responsible for his death. Is she morally responsible? Is she culpable? Is she accountable? Is she blameworthy? How are her social circumstances relevant to the moral assessment of her actions and her agency? What are the implications of this case for the project of civilising blame? And how might the case challenge neo-Strawsonian views that equate responsibility with praise and blame? I just lost my, here we go. So to approach these questions, I begin by referring to Angela Smith's distinction between judgments of responsibility, judgments of culpability, and attitudes of blame. The judgment that an agent is responsible for an action appeals to the notion of attributability, according to Smith. And attributability is variously understood in the literature to mean that the action is expressive of the agent's character and values, that it's expressive of her moral self, or that it falls in some sense under her normative authority. The judgment that an agent is culpable implies, in addition, that she's open to legitimate moral criticism for an action for which she's responsible, on the grounds that she's open to legitimate criticism on the grounds that the action is morally wrong or objectionable. Now, while judgments of responsibility and culpability also seem to imply blameworthiness, Smith argues that these judgments do not entail that active blame is always a normatively appropriate response. And what she means by active blame are negative reactive attitudes like resentment, indignation and anger, expressions of blame, and sanctioning activities such as reproaching, demanding an apology, shunning, and publicising the person's transgressions. Smith discusses three kinds of considerations that she suggests are relevant to assessing the normative appropriateness of active blame. First are considerations related to whether the blamer has the standing to blame the agent. Second, considerations related to the significance or magnitude of the moral fault or action. And third, considerations related to how the blamed agent responds to the moral fault or action. These considerations, she suggests, sort of point to the need for blamers to become more critically self-reflective about their own moral failings and to temper their often unreflective negative emotional responses to the moral failings of others. In other words, they point to the need to civilise, as McGeer puts it, our blaming responses. Andrea Westland raises similar concerns about what she calls strongly vindictive blaming responses. Strongly vindictive blame is judgmental, punitive, and implicitly, to quote Westland, puts the blamer in a position of authority over the blamed, end of quote. Westland argues that in contexts involving structural injustice and power asymmetries, vindictive blame is often unfitting because unfair, because blamers do not often have the normative standing to blame. Hence, their second-order sense of entitlement to blame is normatively inappropriate. And she advocates, by contrast, an attitude of holding responsible without blame, and here she refers back to Picard's notion of holding responsible without blame. This attitude invites the kind of dialogical engagement that, to quote Westland, requires one to give uptake to others' conversational moods. That is, it requires one to hold oneself answerable to their perspectives as well. So the considerations raised by Smith and Westland suggest that it might be normatively appropriate to judge Kaya responsible and culpable insofar as she's open to legitimate moral criticism for the premeditated and carefully planned murder of Chase. However, subjecting her to strongly vindictive blame is normatively inappropriate because unfair, and it's unfair because the moral community that blames her doesn't have the standing to do so, since it is colluded in the injustice and exclusion to which she's been subject all her life. But I think Kaya's case raises deeper and thornier questions about our blaming practices, thornier questions and considerations related to standing to blame. First, it raises the question of whether the constraints under which Kaya acted are such that they undermine or threaten her responsible agency, and hence whether she should be excused or exculpated as an agent, even if the act that she committed was clearly morally wrong. And second, it raises the question of whether the strategy of civilising blame through practices that foster dialogical engagement with others' perspectives is sufficient to address the ways in which our blaming practices can be distorted by entrenched dynamics of social power. So for the next few sections of the paper, I try to address these two questions. Kaya's case raises difficult questions about the nature of excuses, the circumstances under which an agent should appropriately be excused from judgments of culpability and blameworthiness, and the degree to which an agent who acts wrongly in response to a perceived threat might nevertheless be responsible. Strawsonian theories of moral responsibility typically distinguish between excusing and exempting conditions. Excusing conditions aim to show that although an agent may have performed a bad or morally wrongful action, the action should not be attributed to the agent because it's not genuinely expressive of her moral self and is not motivated by ill will. By contrast, exempting conditions aim to show that the agent should be exempted from responsibility for an action because she lacks the relevant capacities for responsible agency, or these capacities are severely impaired either temporarily or permanently. Now, I think that despite her awful upbringing and her terrible social circumstances, Kaya is not incapacitated as a moral agent. There's nothing in the novel that suggests she is incapacitated. So she doesn't seem to meet the conditions for being exempted from responsibility on grounds of any kind of agential incapacity. Moreover, not only is she causally responsible for orchestrating Chase's fall from the fire tower, but it's difficult to deny that the action's attributable to her. She clearly intended that he would die as a result of the fall. She erased evidence that might implicate her, and as such, she could be said to have normatively authorised his death. Yet, given the background circumstances in response to which she acted, it doesn't seem fair to judge her fully capable and blameworthy. Erin Kelly argues for a distinction between two kinds of judgments that suggest one possible way of explicating this sense of unfairness. That is, the judgment, on the one hand, the judgment that an agent's act is wrong, and on the other, the judgment that an agent is to blame for so acting. The judgment that an agent's act is wrong appeals to deontological moral requirements or norms that apply universally and strictly to all persons except those who are morally incapacitated for various reasons and who couldn't be expected to meet those norms. And the rationale, she argues, for the strict application of this kind of strict application of moral requirements is that it does justice to the perspective of the victims of wrongdoing. In contrast, she argues in assessing blameworthiness, we need to take into account considerations of fairness, specifically, and I quote, how reasonable it is to expect an agent to act morally in the face of obstacles, end of quote, that make it so much more difficult for her to meet the requirements of morality than it is for other agents. Now, these obstacles may be external or internal, they may be circumstantial, psychological, and motivational. Considerations of fairness draw attention to the contingency and contextual variability of moral success and failure. Now, Kelly's motivation for just trying to make this distinction between the wrongness of the act and the blameworthiness of the agent is to do justice to a class of cases that she suggests call for an expanded analysis of excusing conditions. And these are cases where the agent acts intentionally and for reasons that are morally criticisable, but where considerations of fairness suggest that due to the external or internal obstacles faced by the agent, blame should be mitigated. Excuses don't necessarily indicate either lack of ill will or an agential incapacity, she argues. Rather, they point to obstacles that trigger our compassion. So if we apply this expanded analysis of excusing conditions to Kaya's case, it could be argued that the obstacles that she faces in meeting moral requirements are more than it seems reasonable to require an agent to bear. So what are these obstacles? How should their impact on the moral choices available to Kaya be understood? And what are their implications for assessing not only her blameworthiness, but also her responsibility and accountability for orchestrating Chase's death? Well, I suggest that the obstacles are intertwined. They're psychological, historical, and structural. The psychological obstacles are her sense of physical vulnerability as a result of the threat that she feels Chase poses to her safety. Also her social isolation and exclusion. The historical obstacles include poverty, abandonment, and the conviction arising from her family history and social circumstances that a woman subject to gender-based violence at the hands of a male abuser will never be free from fear. The structural obstacles include gender and class-based oppression and women's vulnerability to men's social power. So I argue that these obstacles undermine Kaya's sense of moral security, and they twist her reasons for action and her sense of the deliberative options available to her in ways that threaten her autonomy and mitigate her blameworthiness. Nevertheless, she should be still regarded as a responsible agent, accountable for her actions. So the concept of moral security is developed by Jessica Wolfendahl, and as she understands it, it refers to a person's subjective sense that her interests, welfare, needs, and moral standing matter, are recognised by others, and are taken to limit what may be done to her. It also refers to the degree to which, objectively, a person's interests and welfare are regarded as morally important by others within her community, and the degree to which her moral status is accorded appropriate recognition by social, legal, and political institutions. Moral security supports an implicit belief in our moral worth and standing and basic trust in the goodwill of others, but it can be threatened or undermined by neglect, indifference, disrespect, and by acts of malevolent harm. These forms of ill treatment convey the message that one's needs and interests do not matter, that one is not a morally considerable being, and that one can be treated by others with disdain and disrespect. Internalising this message can undermine not only a person's sense of her own moral worth, but also her sense of herself as an agent, insofar as she feels that her control over her own life is constantly vulnerable to the hostile actions of others. Now, clearly, Kaya's sense of moral security has been threatened most of her life, and her assault and attempted rape by Chase and her fear that she'll be constantly under threat by him intensify this sense of moral insecurity to a point that twists her reasons for action and her sense of the deliberative options available to her. Now, I borrowed the notion of twisted reasons from Carla Bagnoli. Her interest is, she develops this in the context of discussion of coercion. So her interest is in explaining why agents who act wrongfully under the influence of coercive threats may nevertheless be responsible and answerable for their actions. And her claim is that coercive threats do not obstruct or bypass, but rather engage coerced agents' capacities for practical reasoning and deliberation. In responding to the threat, the agent engages in rational deliberation and acts on her own reasons and on the basis of her own ends, even if in doing so, she's also bringing about ends that are alien to her, namely those of the coercer in the cases of coercion. But because the agent's actions are based on her own reasons, they're intentional and morally accessible, hence she's morally responsible and accountable. Nevertheless, the coerced agent's deliberation and reasons for action are twisted or distorted at the stage of intention formation by the threat. As a result, the threat and I quote Bagnoli, makes the agent conceive of an end she didn't have in view before learning about the threat, end of quote. Now, Kaya's wrongful action isn't brought about by a coercive threat of the kind that interests Bagnoli, as she's not coerced into bringing about Chase's ends rather than her own. But I suggest that her reasons for action are twisted in a similar way at the stage of intention formation by the threat to her moral security that Chase poses. In deciding that the only way she can regain some modicum of moral security is by orchestrating his death, Kaya deliberates on the basis of her own reasons and ends and acts intentionally to bring about those ends. Hence, she's responsible for her actions. However, her reasons for action and her sense of the deliberative options available to her are twisted or distorted by Chase's assault and the subsequent fear that she will never be free from the threat he poses. And this fear in turn is shaped by her experience of the violence endured by her mother at the hands of her father and by her acute awareness of the structural, epistemic and discursive injustices to which she's subject, and I'll get onto that shortly. These lead Kaya to conceive of an end she didn't have in view before Chase's assault, namely finding a way to permanently remove the threat that he poses to her. Now, according to Bagnoli, the coerced agent's adverse circumstances don't frame deliberation independently and prior to the fact that the agent considers what to do. Rather, they shape the agent's understanding of the action options that are available to her. So, although her adverse circumstances cannot excuse her for moral responsibility, they may mitigate the coerced agent's blameworthiness and call for compassion. In a similar vein, Manuel Vargas argues that it's a mistake to think of culpability simply in terms of the intrinsic features of the agent and her action. Rather, agency and culpability are shaped by the circumstances and context, or what he calls the moral ecology, in relation to which the agent deliberates and acts. In oppressive social contexts that make it especially difficult to exercise responsible agency, or in which there are minimal deliberatively significant action options available to the agent, her culpability for wrongdoing may be mitigated to some degree. So do Kaya's adverse circumstances or the obstacles she faces in meeting moral requirements mitigate her blameworthiness? I submit that they do, because the social context in which she deliberates and exercises her agency undermines her moral security and severely constrains the action possibilities that she perceives to be available to her. So she acts on the basis of her own reasons, but her reasons are twisted by her adverse circumstances. Kaya knows that she cannot escape the threat posed by Chase, either in her home or elsewhere in the marshlands. She knows that if she tries to report the assault to the sheriff, she simply wouldn't be believed, but rather accused of trying to extort money from Chase's parents or of whoring. She's thus acutely aware of her vulnerability to testimonial injustice, and this awareness contributes significantly to her sense of moral insecurity. She knows that her welfare and interests don't matter to the moral community and that her moral status isn't recognised by its social and legal institutions. She knows that whatever Chase does to her, she will not be believed and her testimony will be discounted. In other words, she knows that she doesn't have the epistemic authority to hold him to account, and she knows that Chase knows this, which allows him to act with impunity. So, coming back to the issue from which I started the project of civilising blame. Some advocates for this project emphasise the role of dialogical or conversational practices of blame and holding to account in capacitating responsible agency. McGeer and Pettit, for example, argue that responsibility practices capacitate through a process whereby the interlocutors to the reactive exchange sensitise each other both to the relevant reasons and to the normative expectations that each holds of the other. So they claim that our sensitivity to others' opinions and to our perceived standing in their eyes disposes us to be responsive to the normative expectations of others, who are the actual or prospective audience of our actions. Reactive exchanges develop and reinforce our standing dispositions to reason's responsiveness by recruiting, in specific situations of deliberation, choice and action, this higher order disposition to care about or be responsive to the expectations of others. In the case of failure to meet these expectations, the role of blame is to communicate through blame's censure and sting, the judgment that it was within your power to have exercised your responsiveness to the reasons to which you ought to have been sensitive. Blaming practices, they say, are therefore crucial for capacitating responsible agency, insofar as they convey the message that the agent who fails to meet our expectations could have done otherwise. That is, they could have paid attention to the relevant reasons. Now, I find this analysis quite illuminating in terms of the way it highlights important features of the relational dynamics of responsibility practices. But in light of the discussion of Cairo, I think it also makes very idealising assumptions about the context within which reactive exchanges and blaming judgments take place. And I think these assumptions are especially questionable in contexts characterised by social oppression and epistemic injustice. First, the analysis assumes that the blamer and the agent who's blamed have equal epistemic and normative standing in social space to hold one another to account. However, in social contexts where blame is inflected with social power, this is typically not the case. Rather, the epistemic and normative authority of the parties to the exchange is asymmetrical, and this asymmetry can undermine the reciprocity of the reactive exchange and the capacity of a socially powerless agent to hold others to account. Conversely, where blamers exercise considerable social power, they're likely to be credited with an excess of epistemic and normative authority relative to blamed agents. Second, in oppressive social contexts, the expectations of the actual or prospective audience that the blamed agent could have done otherwise may sometimes not be fair or reasonable. And this isn't because the agent lacks the capacity to have done otherwise, but rather because due to structural or epistemic injustice, the range of deliberatively significant action possibilities available to her is so constrained. So in these kinds of situations, holding on to these kinds of expectations and subjecting individuals to strongly vindictive blaming responses can be a form of culpable ignorance or willful failure on the part of the socially powerful to take epistemic and moral responsibility for their collusion or acquiescence. Rather than capacitating responsible agency, in asymmetrical reactive exchanges, the social regulatory function of blaming practices can therefore serve simultaneously to exonerate the socially powerful and to decapacitate rather than to capacitate less powerful agents and social groups. So the upshot of the argument is twofold. First, I think proponents of dialogical or conversational theories have to take seriously the ways in which the moral dynamics of reactive exchange can be distorted by epistemic injustice and social relations of power. And they need to acknowledge that these dynamics are not always capacitating. And second, while neo-Strawsonian theories tend to equate moral responsibility with liability to praise or blame, I think there are good reasons to distinguish attributions of responsibility from judgments of blameworthiness and negative reactive attitudes of blame. And this is especially the case in contexts where, by virtue of unjust social hierarchies, some agents may have severely constrained possibilities for action and hence limited ability to do otherwise. Thank you.
My paper is entitled Peter Strawson, Moral Theories and the Problem of Blame, Freedom and Resentment Revisited. It is an attempt to, as I see it, correct misinterpretations of Strawson's paper and of views that have become known as Strawsonian theories of moral responsibility. After nearly 60 years, the influence of the paper Freedom and Resentment remains very strong in discussions of moral responsibility. However, I think that as it's become more remote in time and intellectual climate, those influences have become distorted, and the views that are attributed to Strawson on the basis of the paper are often not his views. And in fact, I think objections and, as it were, responses to those objections are misplaced, because I think the paper doesn't actually contain those views. And I've focused specifically in the paper in two of those claims. One is the idea that in Freedom and Resentment, Peter Strawson endorses or is committed to a response response-dependent theory of moral responsibility. And the other is that there is at the heart of the theory a problematic conception of blame, which has given rise to the project of civilizing blame that Catriona scrutinizes in her paper. So in my paper, I delineate the interpretative route from what is said to be Strawson's theory to the project. And then in the rest of the paper, I try to challenge some aspects of the interpretation that is implicit in that route. I start by highlighting what I see as Strawson's aim in freedom and resentment, indeed the aim that he avows, which connects to the issues of compatibilism and incompatibilism with between free will and moral responsibility and determinism. And then I use that construal to challenge those two claims, the response-dependent theory, the attribution of that theory to Strawson, and also the idea that there is this problematic conception of blame at the heart of the paper. In the presentation, I'm going to focus on the second, the problematic conception of blame, and I want to argue that Strawson's characterization of blame is free from the morally objectionable features that are said to create the need for the civilizing project that Catriona has outlined and discussed. And it has actually, Strawson's characterization has the resources to disqualify many of the problematic blaming practices that Catriona focuses on. And then at the end, I'll raise a question for Catriona's own account of morally legitimate blaming. The handout has more material than I'm going to present, but just actually Catriona has already given us a very good sense of how we end up with this view, this need for civilizing blame. These Strawsonian, perhaps neo-Strawsonian conceptions of moral responsibility focus on blaming practices. And I have a quotation here from a collection on blame, which says, "The most common way of conceiving of moral responsibility these days is along broadly Strawsonian lines, emphasizing the importance and explanatory priority of our practice of blaming and holding one another responsible." So with this conception, Strawsonian conception of blame has seemed to give rise to this need to civilize blame because of the ideas that Catriona has already outlined, this concern that blame has an ambivalent nature and our social practices of blaming. On the one hand, it can help to scaffold and capacitate responsible agency, but many philosophers have thought that there is something in the nature of blame that makes it morally objectionable, these negative emotions and this wish to punish that is associated with blaming. And people think that that's a problem for Strawson's theory because he places blame as one of the forms of expressing reactive attitudes at the heart of his account of moral responsibility in freedom and resentment. So in section 3, when I discuss the aim that Strawson himself says he's pursuing in freedom and resentment, which is to reconcile the opponents of the traditional compatibilism debate, I focus specifically on those considerations that Strawson says modify or mollify our reactive attitudes. They are considerations that lead us to take either what he calls the objective stance towards an agent, where we, instead of, as it were, engaging in ordinary interpersonal involvement, we instead engage in practices of management, curing, training, upbringing, and so on. And they are considerations about temporary or permanent incapacity to engage in the participant stand that exempt the agent from responsibility. This could be immaturity, psychological abnormalities, acute mental illnesses, etc., etc. And the other considerations that lead us to take the participant stance, obviously very often implicitly, this participant stand, which involves attitudes of interpersonal involvement and where the personal reactive attitudes belong. So those two stances are, Strawson says, modulated and sometimes suspended on account of a number of considerations. And I think one should divide those into three. There are considerations that, as I said, lead to exemptions of moral responsibility, typically because we take the objective stance. There are considerations that lead to justifications of the action or of the agent, because it becomes clear that the reactive attitude is not warranted because there was no harm, or because there was a harm, but there was not wrong. So it could be because it was an accidental harm, or because in fact the agent, the apparent agent, wasn't an agent, someone was pushed, they didn't really act. And then there are excuses, those cases where the reactive attitude is warranted, but is partly or wholly, the agent is partly or wholly excused because of ignorance, because of a mistake, because of inadvertence, because of reluctance or forced choices, where the point is not that the agent didn't act intentionally. Sometimes it is that they didn't act intentionally when there is ignorance, but sometimes the point is that although intentional, the harm wasn't fully meant. I won't say more about how the argument, the reconciling argument works. I discussed that in the paper, but I just want to highlight that that conception, that the argument seems to me to make it clear that the reactive attitudes are cognitive, emotional attitudes, that they are more or less intense emotional reactions informed by considerations about which attitudes and intentions would be appropriate for an agent to hold towards others, which attitudes and intentions agents actually hold and manifest, and also an agent's incapacities or capacities, the circumstances in which they exercise those capacities when they manifest their attitudes. Then in the third section, I tackle the question whether Strawson in the paper endorses a theory of moral responsibility, and whether if he does is this response-dependent theory, and I say that he doesn't. But I want to move to the fourth section, which is engages with the question of blame and the project of civilizing blame. And that's because, as I said, some people have thought that Strawson's own account of blame, which is so closely connected to his conception of moral responsibility, is problematic. And is problematic because his conception of blame has those features that have led to this perceived need for the project of civilizing blame. The worry was articulated early on by Gary Watson, who, despite his admiration for freedom and resentment, saw a troubling connection in Strawson's views between the practice of holding one another responsible and retributive sentiments, and hence limitation of goodwill. The problem, as Watson sees it, is that this link between holding one another responsible and these retributive sentiments implies that if one is skeptical about retribution, about retributive views of punishment, then one must be skeptical about responsibility. And that on Strawson's account, holding one another responsible is actually also at odds with one, as Watson puts it, historically important ideal of love. The ideal is embodied by moral exemplars such as Gandhi or Martin Luther King, who, Watson says, while unequivocally holding responsible those guilty of oppression and injustices and making appropriate demands on behalf of their victims, nonetheless, those ideals, those exemplars manage or come much closer than others to managing to do such things without vindictiveness or malice. And Watson thinks there is a problem for Strawson here, because for Strawson, the reactive attitudes involve, as he puts it, as Strawson puts it, partial withdrawal of goodwill and the preparedness to acquiesce in the infliction of suffering on the offender, which is an essential part of punishment. Now, to assess how apt this charge is against Strawson, I think we need to separate two claims. One is that Strawson's characterization of blame involves a problematic retributivist view of punishment. The other is that any retributivist view of punishment, or at any rate the one that Strawson embraces, involves vindictiveness or malice as essential part of it. I think both claims are off target, and I start with the second. It is consistent, I think, with Strawson's picture that moral indignation or resentment and self-directed guilt should not involve even an inclination or desire to punish, let alone vindictiveness or malice. What Strawson says is required is acquiescence to punishment, or for the offender, the foregoing of resentment in the face of punishment, if punishment turns out to be appropriate. Acquiescing to punishment involves loosening the general demand that another should, if possible, be spared suffering, this is Strawson's phrase, a demand that we make and so may loosen for ourselves too. But since this acquiescence may in fact be intensely reluctant, I think it's doubtful that for Strawson, indignation, that moral indignation that goes with moral blame, need involve vindictiveness or malice or related, possibly unsavory feelings such as sadism or masochism and so on. And the second claim implicit in Watson's criticism is that Strawson's conception of blame involves a retributivist attitude to punishment. I think it does, but I think it's a minimally retributivist conception. So I don't think that it is in fact in tension with Watson's important ideal or otherwise problematic. Strawson himself says that the reactive attitudes mustn't involve a preparedness to punish by inflicting, as he puts it, indiscriminate suffering. And this, I think, gives us a sense in which his view of punishment is retributivist. That is the sense in which it involves the idea of repayment. Punishment must be deserved by the offender and also proportionate to the offense. That's what it means, that it's not indiscriminate. On the other hand, because Strawson disallows punishment, which is in accordance with procedures which we know to be wholly useless in bringing about the social goods punishment aims at, Strawson's view also disallows punishment for its own sake, or punishment as a form of revenge. Sorry, I realized I was very behind. So this position would recommend the modification or abandon of forms of punishment that are counterproductive or morally compromised. So it is at least consistent with, and perhaps arguably committed to, attitudes to punishment that aim primarily at rehabilitation, deterrence, or protection, and that may arise from or be consistent with sympathy and compassion. We should remember that Strawson aims to incorporate the sense of desert that the pessimist is rightly shocked to find lacking in the optimist's inadequate understanding of our practice of holding each other responsible. So it is inadequate because it's purely consequentialist. So Strawson wants to make sure that that's not the only understanding of punishment. Punishment must be deserved. But at the same time, we mustn't lose whatever real social utility the practices of punishment may have. And because of this, I'm not convinced that his view is problematic in the ways that Watson and others have suggested. So where does this leave the philosophical project of civilizing blame in relation to Strawson's views and more generally? I think here it may be helpful to distinguish two different, though related tasks. One is that of providing a philosophically adequate account of blame, and the other is to identify the conditions that make it right or appropriate to blame someone for something, by whom and when, and relatedly which, if any, forms or sanctions or punishment would be justified and effective. I think concerning the first, Strawson's account has been thought problematic because it's taken to validate negative, destructive emotions and a vindictive attitude that some find morally troubling. I've tried to show that in my response to Watson, that the worry about objectionable retributivist attitudes in Strawson's conception of blame is misplaced. On the other hand, while negative sentiments of resentment, indignation, and guilt are indeed central to Strawson's characterization of the blaming reactive attitudes, it's not clear that these are in themselves morally objectionable responses to wrongdoing. To be sure, the warrant for or appropriateness of anger or resentment may often be questionable, and excessive indulgence in them may be destructive. Nonetheless, a degree of moral indignation or a sense of guilt in the face of egregious offenses is arguably not merely acceptable, but sometimes required for both normative and instrumental reasons. And to that extent, I think Strawson's account of blame, as instantiated in some of those reactive attitudes that he places at the center of his view, stands unimpeached. To the second task, the task of the standing to blame, as it were, I think freedom and resentment makes at least two important contributions. One is to draw attention to the broad categories of exculpation that I mentioned, exemptions, justifications, and excuses that constrain the appropriateness of the reactive attitudes. And the other is the justification of punishment that I canvassed earlier. These help to circumscribe culpability and at least partly the appropriateness of sanctions and punishments, and they contribute to understanding the conditions for appropriate blaming. But it's true that beside these considerations, there are the normative questions about standing to blame and about the forms that blaming and punishment might take. And it is here that many of the important issues raised by Catriona in her paper find their proper place. Now, I won't summarize, Catriona has summarized for us her case and her take on the fictional character Kaya. And I think she brings out convincingly the importance of the dynamics of social power when considering not simply who has the standing to blame her, but just how blameworthy Kaya is. And I agree with much of what she says about both, but I want to raise a small point of disagreement and a question. The point of disagreement is that I don't agree that Strawsonian analysis of excusing conditions cannot accommodate the sorts of factors that Catriona thinks mitigate Kaya's blameworthiness. My discussion of Strawson's view of exculpation in section 2 explains why. I think given the threat and her marginalization, the structural, epistemic, and discursive injustices to which Kaya is subject, it's not clear that she had a choice. And if she didn't have a choice, that would mitigate her culpability. To paraphrase Strawson, we may see her acting for reasons which acceptably override her general reluctance to harm others. But perhaps this disagreement is superficial. I think Strawson's analysis can accommodate them, but it may be that, as Catriona says, some so-called Strawsonian analysis of moral responsibility and blame can't accommodate this. But my question to Catriona is this. She says that the reasons that lead Kaya to kill are twisted by her fear, her childhood experience of violence, and her being the subject of structural injustices. However, insofar as we agree that her predicament mitigates her guilt, isn't that because we think that she has legitimate reasons to act as she does? And if that is right, in what sense are her reasons twisted? Let me finish with a comment about how Strawson's view relates to these issues about standing to blame and about the dangers of our practices of blaming. Towards the end of Freedom and Resentment, Strawson suggests that increased reflection on and study of the reactive attitudes and associated practices in their social, historical, and anthropological sciences should make us cautious of claiming universality for aspects of these attitudes that may be quite local in space or time. And in addition, he points out that psychological and psychoanalytic studies increase our distrust in the practices because they reinforce with aseptic clarity that common wisdom that these practices are, and I quote Strawson here, a prime realm of self-deception, of the ambiguous and the shady, of guilt transference and conscious sadism and the rest. I think Catriona's paper aptly reminds us that in addition to these, the practices are a minefield of occasions for compounding the injustices that arise, at least partly, from pre-existing unjust social hierarchies. Thank you.